The afternoon sun was getting lower in the Brooklyn sky when Margaret Thompson finished her weekly shopping trip. At 73 years old, she moved a little slower than she used to, but she was still proud of her independence. Her cloth shopping bag was heavy with groceries, fresh apples, a loaf of bread, some milk, and the ingredients for her famous chicken soup that she planned to make for her neighbor's sick grandson. Margaret had been making this same walk for over 40 years. She knew every crack in the sidewalk, every shop owner, and every face in the neighborhood. Today felt different, though. There was tension in the air that she couldn't quite place. People seemed more hurried, more on edge. She noticed several police cars had driven by in the last hour, their sirens cutting through the usual city sounds. What Margaret didn't know was that just 20 minutes earlier, a young man had robbed Peterson's electronics store 3 blocks away. The thief had grabbed an expensive camera and ran, carrying it in what witnesses described as an old cloth bag, maybe brown or gray. The store owner, Mr. Peterson, was shaken up, and his description was rushed and unclear. He told the responding officers the robber was average height, maybe older, carrying a cloth bag with something heavy inside. Officer Danny Rodriguez was new to the force, just 6 months out of the academy. His partner, Officer Kevin Walsh, had only 2 years of experience himself. They were both eager to make a good impression and prove themselves. When they got the call about the robbery, Rodriguez felt his heart rate spike. This was his first real chance to catch a criminal in the act. The radio crackled with the description. Suspect may still be in the area, carrying stolen goods in a cloth bag. Approach with caution. Rodriguez repeated the details to Walsh as they drove slowly through the neighborhood streets, their eyes scanning every person they passed. That's when they spotted Margaret. She was walking slowly down Maple Street, her gray cloth bag clearly heavy in her arms. From their car window, she matched what they thought they were looking for. Walsh pointed her out first. Look, Danny. Gray bag, moving slow, trying not to draw attention. Rodriguez nodded, his training kicking in. They had learned that criminals often tried to blend in after committing crimes. What they didn't consider was that half the elderly people in Brooklyn carried similar bags when they went grocery shopping. The officers parked their patrol car and got out, their hands instinctively moving toward their belts where their equipment hung. Rodriguez felt nervous energy coursing through his body. This was it, his first real arrest. Walsh was thinking about how good it would look on their record to catch a robber so quickly. Ma'am, stop right there, Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying more authority than he felt inside. Margaret looked around, confused. She couldn't imagine why a police officer would be talking to her. She kept walking, thinking they must be addressing someone else. Hey, I said stop! Walsh joined in, and now both officers were walking quickly toward her. Margaret finally realized they were talking to her. She stopped and turned around, her face showing genuine confusion. Her mind raced, trying to think if she had done something wrong. Had she forgotten to pay for something at the store? Had she accidentally walked into the street against a light? Officers, is there a problem? Margaret asked politely. She had always taught her students to respect authority figures, and even in her confusion, her natural politeness came through. Rodriguez approached her with what he thought was professional confidence, but came across as aggressive. We need to see what's in that bag, ma'am. Put it down slowly and step back. Margaret's confusion deepened. My bag? It's just groceries, officer. I just came from Murphy's Market. She gestured back toward the store she had left 10 minutes earlier. Put the bag down now. Walsh's voice was sharper, and Margaret could see that both officers looked tense. Her hands started to shake slightly. She had never been in trouble with police before. The situation felt surreal and frightening. Margaret slowly placed her bag on the sidewalk, her arthritis making the movement more awkward than usual. I don't understand what's happening, she said quietly. Did I do something wrong? Rodriguez was looking at the bag, trying to see inside it. The top was folded over, hiding the contents. To him, this seemed suspicious. Why would an innocent person fold their bag closed if they had nothing to hide? His academy training had emphasized being alert for signs of deception. Step away from the bag, Walsh ordered. Margaret took a small step backward, but her movement was slow because of her age and the shock of the situation. To the officers, her hesitation looked like resistance. By now, a few people on the street had stopped to watch. An older man walking. His dog paused at the corner. A woman coming out of the bakery held her door open, watching the scene unfold. A teenager on his bike pulled over, instinctively reaching for his phone. Margaret noticed the gathering crowd and felt embarrassed. She was a private person who had never liked being the center of attention. "Officers, please, can we talk about this quietly? I'm sure there's been some mistake." But Rodriguez interpreted her request as an attempt to manipulate the situation. His training had warned him about suspects who tried to appear helpless to avoid arrest. He looked at Walsh, and both officers seemed to make a silent decision to take control of the situation more firmly. "Ma'am, we need you to comply with our instructions," Rodriguez said, his voice getting harder. "This is a police investigation." Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She had never felt so helpless and confused. "Investigation? What investigation? I was just buying groceries for my soup." The mention of soup struck Walsh as odd. Why would someone mention such a specific detail unless they were making up a story? In his limited experience, he had learned that people often over-explained when they were lying. "We need to search that bag," Walsh said firmly. "And we need you to stay exactly where you are." Rodriguez moved toward the bag, and Margaret instinctively stepped forward. "Please be careful with the apples," she said. "They bruise easily, and I need them for my neighbor's grandson. He's been sick and—" "Don't move," Rodriguez snapped, misunderstanding her motherly concern as an attempt to interfere with evidence. His sharp tone caused Margaret to freeze in fear. The teenager with the phone had started recording. The man with the dog was shaking his head disapprovingly. The woman from the bakery had come fully outside now, and more people were beginning to notice the commotion. Margaret stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, watching as Officer Rodriguez knelt down beside her grocery bag. She couldn't understand how buying apples and bread had turned into what felt like a criminal investigation. Her mind was spinning with worry and confusion. This was supposed to be a simple walk home. Instead, it was becoming the most frightening afternoon of her life. And it was about to get much worse. Officer Rodriguez opened Margaret's grocery bag and immediately felt foolish. Inside were 3 red apples, a loaf of whole wheat bread, a carton of milk, and a small package of chicken pieces. No stolen camera, no electronics, nothing that could possibly be connected to the robbery they were investigating. But instead of admitting their mistake right away, both officers felt the pressure of the growing crowd watching them. Rodriguez looked up at his partner Walsh with uncertainty in his eyes. Walsh could see the doubt there, but he also noticed that more people had stopped to watch. A woman with a baby stroller had paused across the street. 2 construction workers had come out of a building they were renovating. The teenager was still recording everything on his phone. "This is just food," Rodriguez whispered to Walsh, trying to keep his voice low enough that the crowd couldn't hear. But Walsh was thinking about how this would look in their report. How would they explain stopping an innocent old lady for buying groceries? Their supervisor, Sergeant Morrison, was already questioning whether they were ready for street duty. Making a mistake this public would not help their case. Maybe she dumped the real evidence somewhere, Walsh said, loud enough for Margaret to hear. Maybe this is just her cover story. Margaret heard this and felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. Cover story? Officer, I'm 73 years old. I taught elementary school for 42 years. I've never even had a parking ticket. What cover story? Her voice was getting shaky now, a mixture of fear and growing frustration. She had always believed that if you were honest and respectful with police, everything would work out fine. That's what she had taught her students. That's what she had always believed about the world. Rodriguez stood up, still holding her bag. Ma'am, we're going to need to ask you some more questions. Where exactly did you go today? What time did you leave your house? Can anyone verify your story? The questions felt like an attack to Margaret. Verify my story? I went to Murphy's. Market like I do every Thursday. Mr. Murphy knows me. Mrs. Chen at the flower shop next door knows me. I've been shopping there for decades. But Walsh was thinking about what his training officer had told him. Criminals always have explanations. Ready? The smoother the story, the more suspicious you should be. Margaret's detailed knowledge of the neighborhood seemed rehearsed to him. We're going to need to see some identification, Walsh said, taking a step closer to Margaret. Margaret reached into her small purse for her wallet, but her hands were trembling now. The wallet slipped from her fingers and fell to the sidewalk, spilling some of its contents. Her social security card, a few receipts, and a photo of her late husband scattered on the concrete. "Don't move!" Rodriguez shouted instinctively when he saw her bend down to collect her things. His training had taught him that sudden movements could be dangerous, but Margaret was just trying to pick up her husband's photograph. The crowd was getting larger and more restless. The man with the dog shook his head and said loudly, "This is ridiculous. Can't you see she's just an old lady with groceries?" A woman in scrubs, probably a nurse getting off work, called out, "Why are you treating her like a criminal?" "What did she do?" Walsh felt his face getting hot. He could see people were starting to take sides, and they weren't siding with the police. But instead of reconsidering their approach, he felt defensive. "Everyone step back, this is police business." Margaret had managed to gather most of her scattered belongings, but she was now crying softly. The photograph of her husband was wrinkled from falling on the rough sidewalk. She had carried that picture for 15 years, since the day he passed away from cancer. "Please," she said to the officers, holding up her driver's license with a shaking hand. "Here's my identification. Margaret Thompson. I live 6 blocks from here on Oak Street. I just want to go home and make soup for little Tommy next door. He has the flu, and his grandmother asked me to help." Rodriguez looked at the license. Margaret Thompson, age 73. Address on Oak Street, clean record. Everything checked out exactly as she said. But now he was in too deep to back down easily. Walsh was watching him. The crowd was watching him, and admitting they had made a complete mistake felt impossible. "We still need to verify your story," Rodriguez said weakly. "There was a robbery in the area, and you match some of the description." "What description?" Margaret asked, her teacher instincts kicking in despite her fear. "I'm an elderly woman buying groceries. How could I possibly match the description of a robber?" This was a fair question that neither officer could answer well. The truth was that the only thing Margaret had in common with the actual robber was carrying a cloth bag, and half the neighborhood carried similar bags. The teenager recording spoke up. "Yo, this is crazy. She's obviously not a robber. Why don't you just let her go home?" Walsh spun toward the teenager. "Put that phone away. You're interfering with a police investigation." "I'm not interfering with anything," the teenager replied calmly. "I'm standing on a public sidewalk recording what's happening in public. That's legal." Now Walsh was getting angry at the teenager, frustrated with the situation and embarrassed in front of the crowd. He took several steps toward the young man. "I said put the phone away." Margaret watched this happening and felt a deep sadness. This wasn't how she had taught her students that police interactions should go. This wasn't the world she thought she lived in. She had always told children that police officers were helpers, people you could trust when you were scared or in trouble. "Officer," she said quietly, "I don't understand why this is happening. I've been nothing but polite. I've answered all your questions. I've shown you my identification. What else do you need from me?" Rodriguez looked at her and really saw, what everyone else was seeing. A frightened elderly woman who clearly posed no threat to anyone. A retired teacher who just wanted to go home and make soup for a sick child. A person who had done nothing wrong except be in the wrong place at the wrong time while carrying groceries. But Walsh was still focused on the teenager with the phone. "You need to stop recording and move along." "I'm not going anywhere," the teenager said firmly. "And I'm not stopping recording. This lady needs witnesses to what you're doing to her." More people in the crowd nodded in agreement. Someone else had started recording too. Margaret looked around at all these strangers who were standing up for her, and she felt a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. The construction workers were talking among themselves, and one of them called out, "Come on, officers, look at her. Does she really look like a criminal to you?" Walsh felt surrounded and defensive. Instead of de-escalating, he made the situation worse. He turned back to Margaret and said firmly, "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us to the station for further questioning." Margaret's eyes went wide with fear. "The station? Am I under arrest? What are you arresting me for?" The crowd was getting more vocal now. Someone shouted, "This is harassment." Another person said, "Leave her alone." Rodriguez was beginning to panic. This was supposed to be a simple stop and search, but it was turning into a public relations nightmare. He looked at the growing crowd, at Margaret's tear-streaked face, at his partner who seemed determined to make things worse, and realized they needed help. Just as he was about to call for backup, he heard a commotion from down the street. Someone was pushing through the crowd, a voice cutting through the noise with natural authority. Everything was about to change. The voice that cut through the crowd belonged to someone everyone recognized instantly, even though they couldn't believe their eyes. Mike Tyson was walking quickly toward the scene, his distinctive silhouette unmistakable even from a distance. He had just finished speaking at the Brooklyn Community Center 3 blocks away, where he regularly visited to talk to young people about making better choices in life. "What's going on here?" Tyson's voice carried natural authority, but it wasn't aggressive. It was the voice of someone who had seen enough conflict in his life to know when a situation needed calming down, rather than heating up. The crowd started murmuring excitedly. "Is that really Mike Tyson? Oh my God, it's Iron Mike! What's he doing here?" But Tyson wasn't paying attention to the recognition. His eyes were focused on Margaret, who was clearly distressed, and the 2 officers who looked like they were in over their heads. Officer Rodriguez felt his heart skip a beat. Having Mike Tyson show up in the middle of what was already becoming a nightmare scenario was not something they had covered in police academy training. Walsh, meanwhile, tried to maintain his authoritative stance, but his voice came out shakier than he intended. "Sir, this is a police matter. We need you to step back and let us handle this." Tyson stopped about 10 feet away from the group, close, enough to be part of the conversation, but far enough to not seem threatening. Despite his fearsome reputation in the boxing ring, people who knew him personally understood that he had spent years learning to control his emotions and approach conflicts with wisdom rather than force. "I can see it's a police matter," Tyson said calmly. "But I also see an elderly lady who looks scared, and I'm wondering if maybe I can help everyone figure out what's really happening here." Margaret looked up at this famous man who had suddenly appeared like an unlikely guardian angel. She had seen him on television many times over the years, but in person, what struck her most wasn't his intimidating physical presence. It was the kindness in his eyes. She could see that he genuinely cared about what was happening to her. "Sir, I'm sorry, but even if you are who I think you are, you can't interfere with a police investigation," Walsh said, trying to sound official, but his voice betrayed his nervousness. He had grown up watching Mike Tyson fights, and now here he was trying to tell his childhood hero to back off. "I'm not trying to interfere with anything," Tyson replied, his tone remaining respectful but firm. "I'm just trying to understand the situation, ma'am," he said, turning to Margaret. "Are you all right? Do you need any medical attention?" This simple question of concern broke something loose in Margaret's composure. Here was someone, a complete stranger, showing her more kindness and respect than the police officers who were supposed to protect and serve her community. "I'm okay physically," Margaret said, wiping tears from her eyes. "But I'm scared and confused. I was just walking home from buying groceries and now they want to take me to the police station. I don't understand what I did wrong." Tyson nodded and looked at the officers. "Officers, what exactly is she suspected of doing?" Rodriguez found himself in the strange position of having to explain their actions to one of the most famous people in the world, while a crowd of neighborhood residents watched and recorded everything. There was a robbery in the area earlier. The suspect was described as carrying a cloth bag, and she matches some aspects of the description. Tyson looked at Margaret, then at her grocery bag, then back at the officers. Some aspects of the description? What aspects exactly? This was the question that Rodriguez had been dreading, because when he said it out loud, he knew how ridiculous it would sound. The suspect was carrying a cloth bag. "A cloth bag," Tyson repeated slowly. And this lady was carrying a cloth bag with groceries in it. That's right, Walsh jumped in, trying to support his partner. And when we asked her to stop, she seemed nervous and evasive. Margaret spoke up, her voice stronger now with Tyson's presence giving her confidence. I was confused because I couldn't imagine why police officers were stopping me. I've never been in trouble in my life. I taught elementary school for over 40 years. Tyson smiled at this. A teacher? My respect for teachers is enormous. They do some of the hardest and most important work in the world. He looked back at the officers. So let me understand this. You stopped a 73-year-old retired teacher because she was carrying groceries in a cloth bag? The crowd was growing larger, and people were getting more vocal in their support for Margaret and their criticism of the officers' handling of the situation. Someone called out, "Tell them, Mike." Another person said, "This is ridiculous." But Tyson raised his hand slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to quiet the crowd without being aggressive. Let's all stay calm here. We want to help resolve this situation, not make it worse. Rodriguez was beginning to realize just how badly they had mishandled everything. Standing there with Mike Tyson asking reasonable questions, with a crowd of people watching with cameras recording, he could see their actions for what they really were. A massive overreaction based on almost no evidence. "Mr. Tyson," Rodriguez said, "we were just trying to investigate a robbery. We thought we were doing our job." "I understand that," Tyson replied. "Police work is hard and you want to catch the real criminals. But sometimes when we're trying so hard to do the right thing, we can end up doing the wrong thing instead." This wasn't the response the officers had expected. Tyson wasn't attacking them or trying to embarrass them. He was treating them with respect while also advocating for Margaret. His approach was disarming in the best possible way. "The thing is," Tyson continued, "I've made plenty of mistakes in my life, big ones, and I've learned that the best thing to do when you realize you've made a mistake is to admit it, fix it if you can, and learn from it." Margaret was watching this exchange with amazement. She had never seen someone handle a tense situation with such a combination of strength and gentleness. Tyson was clearly in control of the moment, but he wasn't using that control to humiliate anyone. Walsh was still trying to maintain some semblance of authority. "Mr. Tyson, we appreciate your concern, but we still have procedures we need to follow." "What procedures?" Tyson asked. "You searched her bag and found groceries. You checked her identification and found out she's exactly who she says she is. You asked her questions and her answers all checked out. What procedure requires you to arrest someone for buying apples and bread?" The teenager who had been recording the whole thing spoke up. "He's right. She didn't do anything wrong." Other people in the crowd started agreeing more loudly. The construction workers were nodding. The nurse who had stopped to watch was saying, "This is exactly right." But instead of the crowd getting angry or aggressive, Tyson's calm leadership seemed to be influencing everyone. People were supporting Margaret and criticizing the officers' actions, but they were doing it in a way that focused on solving the problem rather than just venting frustration. Tyson walked closer to Margaret, moving slowly and keeping his body language non-threatening. "Ma'am, what's your name?" "Margaret Thompson," she replied. "And thank you for stopping to help me. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't shown up." "Mrs. Thompson, you don't need to thank me. Any decent person would have stopped to help." He looked around at the crowd. "Look at all these people who stopped to make sure you were treated fairly. This neighborhood cares about you." Then Tyson turned back to the officers and his voice took on a slightly more serious tone. "Officers, I think it's time to end this situation. Mrs. Thompson has done nothing wrong. You've checked her bag, you've seen her identification, and you've asked your questions. There's no reasonable basis to detain her any longer." Rodriguez knew Tyson was right. Everything about their stop had been based on the flimsiest of evidence, and now they were just making things worse by continuing to detain an innocent woman. But admitting they were wrong in front of all these people, including a celebrity, felt incredibly difficult. Just then, Rodriguez's radio crackled with a voice from dispatch. "Unit 247, we have an update on the robbery suspect. Subject has been apprehended 6 blocks south of your location. White male, age approximately 25, found with stolen camera equipment. The real robber had been caught. Margaret Thompson was completely innocent, just as everyone had been trying to tell them. The silence that followed the radio announcement was deafening. Everyone had heard it clearly. The real robber had been caught 6 blocks away. He was a 25-year-old white male with the actual stolen camera equipment. Nothing like Margaret Thompson at all. Officer Rodriguez felt his stomach drop. He looked at his partner Walsh, whose face had gone pale. They had just spent the last 30 minutes harassing an innocent elderly woman in front of a growing crowd that now included one of the most famous people in the world. The evidence of their mistake was now being broadcast over the police radio for everyone to hear. Mike Tyson didn't gloat or make the officers feel worse than they already did. Instead, he simply nodded and said quietly, "Well, that settles that question, doesn't it?" Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed immediately by a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. "So I was right all along," she said, her voice shaking. "I was telling the truth the whole time. I really was just an old lady buying groceries." The crowd erupted in supportive cheers and some angry comments directed at the officers. "They owe her an apology," someone shouted. "This was harassment," called out another person. But Tyson again raised his hand, and somehow his gesture calmed everyone down. "Mrs. Thompson," Tyson said gently, "you have every right to be upset. What happened to you was wrong, and you shouldn't have had to go through this." Rodriguez finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. We made a mistake." "A mistake?" Margaret's teacher voice came out, the same tone she had used when students tried to make excuses for not doing their homework. "A mistake is adding 2 plus 2 and getting 5. This was treating me like a criminal when I did absolutely nothing wrong." Walsh stepped forward, trying to salvage something from the situation. "Mrs. Thompson, we were responding to a robbery call and we were trying to protect the community. Sometimes in police work, we have to investigate situations that turn out to be nothing." But Tyson shook his head. "Officer, with respect, this wasn't just investigating. Mrs. Thompson told you from the beginning that she was grocery shopping. You searched her bag and found groceries. You checked her identification and found she was exactly who she said she was. At what point did investigation turn into harassment?" The teenager who had been recording the whole thing spoke up. "Yeah. And you were going to arrest her for what, buying apples?" Margaret was thinking about all the times she had taught her students about fairness and justice, about how important it was to treat people with respect and dignity. She had always believed that police officers were heroes who protected people. Now she felt confused and hurt about everything she thought she knew. "I keep thinking about my students," Margaret said, looking at the officers. "All those years, I taught children to respect police officers. I told them that if they were ever in trouble, they should find a police officer because you would help them and keep them safe. What am I supposed to think now?" This hit Rodriguez harder than any angry accusation could have. He thought about his own grandmother, who was about Margaret's age, and how he would feel if she had been treated this way. He thought about why he became a police officer in the first place, to help people and make his community safer. "Mrs. Thompson," Rodriguez said, and this time his voice was genuinely remorseful, "you should still teach children to trust police officers. Most of us really are trying to do the right thing. We messed up today. I messed up today." Tyson nodded approvingly at this. "That takes courage to admit, officer. Making mistakes is human. Taking responsibility for them and learning from them is what separates good people from everyone else." Walsh was still struggling with the situation. He was young, prideful, and embarrassed to be corrected in front of so many people. "We were just doing our jobs," he muttered. "No," said the construction worker who had been watching everything. "Your job is to protect and serve. You weren't protecting her, you were scaring her." Margaret looked around at all the people who had stopped what they were doing to stand up for her. The teenager with his phone, the construction workers, the nurse, the man with his dog, the woman with the baby stroller. Even people she didn't recognize had taken time out of their day to make sure she was treated fairly. "You know what amazes me?" Margaret said to the crowd. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, and some of you I've never met before today, but you all stopped to help a stranger. That gives me hope. Tyson smiled at this. Mrs. Thompson, that's the Brooklyn I know. People here look out for each other. That's what community means. Rodriguez's radio crackled again. This time it was Sergeant Morrison's voice. Unit 247, report to my location immediately for debriefing on the Thompson incident. Both officers winced. Word was already getting back to their supervisor, which meant this incident was going to have consequences beyond just the embarrassment they were feeling right now. Officers, Tyson said, before you go, I think Mrs. Thompson deserves more than just a quick apology. What are you going to do to make this right? Walsh looked annoyed by the question. We said we were sorry. What else do you want us to do? But Rodriguez was thinking more clearly now. No, he's right. Mrs. Thompson, is there anything we can do? Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention? Can we help you get home? Margaret looked at her grocery bag, which had been sitting on the sidewalk this whole time. Some of her apples had rolled out, and she wasn't sure if the milk container had been damaged when Rodriguez searched through her things. My groceries are probably ruined, she said sadly. I was going to make soup for little Tommy next door. He's been sick with the flu, and his grandmother is too old to cook for him. Without hesitation, Tyson pulled out his wallet. Officers, I think the least you can do is replace Mrs. Thompson's groceries and anything else that got damaged today. Rodriguez nodded immediately. Of course, Mrs. Thompson will replace everything and anything else you need. But Margaret waved off the money. I don't want your money. I just want to know that this won't happen to someone else. What if you had stopped someone who didn't speak English well? What if you had stopped someone who was scared of police because of bad experiences in their home country? What if it had been someone who didn't have all these people watching and recording to protect them? This was a sobering thought that made everyone in the crowd go quiet for a moment. Margaret had put her finger on something important. She had been protected by witnesses, by Tyson's intervention, and by her ability to articulate her situation clearly. Not everyone would have those advantages. Tyson looked at the officers seriously. That's a really important point, Mrs. Thompson. Officers, what procedures do you have in place to make sure situations like this don't escalate unnecessarily? Walsh was getting frustrated by all the questions and criticism. Look, we made a mistake, okay? We're human. It happens. It happens? The nurse in scrubs spoke up angrily. It happens to who? Does it happen to young white guys in suits? Or does it mostly happen to elderly ladies and people of color, and anyone who looks like they might not be able to fight back? This comment hit at the heart of something larger than just this one incident, and everyone knew it. The crowd was starting to get more agitated again, and Tyson could sense the mood shifting. Let's not lose focus here, Tyson said diplomatically. We're not trying to solve all the problems in the world right now. We're trying to make sure Mrs. Thompson is treated fairly, and that everyone learns something from this situation. Margaret appreciated how Tyson was handling everything, but she was tired and emotionally drained. I just want to go home, she said quietly. I want to make my soup, and I want to forget this ever happened. Rodriguez looked at his watch and realized they had been detaining Margaret for almost 45 minutes. 45 minutes of her life that she would never get back. 45 minutes of fear and humiliation that she didn't deserve. Mrs. Thompson, Rodriguez said, can we at least drive you home? And can we replace your groceries? It's the least we can do. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. She could see that he genuinely felt bad about what had happened. Walsh still seemed defensive and resentful, but Rodriguez appeared to have learned something from the experience. I'll accept a ride home, Margaret said finally. But Mr. Tyson, would you mind coming with me? I don't think I'm ready to be alone with police officers just yet. Tyson didn't hesitate. Of course, Mrs. Thompson. I'd be honored to make sure you get home safely. The ride to Margaret's house was quiet at first. She sat in the back seat of the police car with Mike Tyson beside her, while Officer Rodriguez drove, and Walsh sat in the passenger seat looking out the window. Margaret had never imagined she would be riding in a police car, especially not under these circumstances and especially not with a former heavyweight boxing champion as her protector. Are you doing okay, Mrs. Thompson? Tyson asked gently as they turned onto her street. Margaret nodded, but she was thinking about how different everything felt now. Just 2 hours ago, she had been a normal elderly woman going about her weekly routine. Now she felt like she had been through a life-changing experience that she didn't fully understand yet. There, she said, pointing to a small brick house with a well-maintained garden. The blue one with the rose bushes. Rodriguez parked the car and got out to open Margaret's door, but Tyson was already helping her out. As they walked toward her front porch, Margaret noticed her neighbor Mrs. Chen peeking through her curtains. Word would spread quickly through the neighborhood about what had happened. "Mrs. Thompson," Rodriguez said as they reached her front. "Tortanum, I want you to know that I'm going to speak to my supervisor about what happened today. This isn't how we're supposed to treat people in our community." Margaret looked at him for a moment, trying to decide if she believed he was sincere. "Officer Rodriguez, can I ask you something?" "Of course, ma'am." "Do you have a grandmother?" The question surprised him. "Yes, I do. She lives in Queens." "Would you want someone to treat her the way you treated me today?" Rodriguez felt his throat tighten. "No, ma'am. Absolutely not." "Then promise me you'll remember this feeling the next time you're in a situation where you have to decide how to treat someone. Promise me you'll ask yourself, what if this was my grandmother?" "I promise," Rodriguez said, and Margaret could hear in his voice that he meant it. Walsh remained silent, still struggling with his pride and unwilling to admit how wrong they had been, but Tyson noticed his silence and addressed him directly. "Officer Walsh, what do you think you learned from today?" Walsh shrugged uncomfortably. "I learned that sometimes witnesses and bystanders can make a situation more complicated than it needs to be." This answer revealed that Walsh still didn't understand what had really happened. The witnesses hadn't made the situation complicated. They had protected Margaret from being treated even worse than she was. Margaret shook her head sadly. "Officer Walsh, those people weren't making things complicated. They were making sure I was safe. Without them, without Mr. Tyson, I hate to think what might have happened to me." Tyson looked at Walsh seriously. "Officer, those people were doing what community members are supposed to do, looking out for each other. They weren't your enemies today. They were trying to help everyone involved make better choices." But Walsh wasn't ready to hear this message. Yet. Some people need more time to process their mistakes before they can learn from them. After the officers left, Tyson helped Margaret carry her groceries inside. Her house was small but immaculately clean, filled with photographs of students from her teaching years and family members. The walls told the story of a life dedicated to helping others. "Can I make you some tea, Mr. Tyson?" Margaret asked, still feeling surreal about having such a famous person in her living room. "That would be nice, Mrs. Thompson. But please, call me Mike." As Margaret put the kettle on, she noticed that her hands were still shaking slightly. The afternoon had taken more of a toll on her than she wanted to admit. "Are you sure you're all right?" Tyson asked, noticing her trembling hands. "I think so. It's just, I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't shown up. Would they really have arrested me? Would I have spent the night in jail?" Tyson sat down at her small kitchen table. "I don't know, Mrs. Thompson, but I'm glad we don't have to find out." They sat together drinking tea and talking about the neighborhood, about Margaret's years as a teacher, and about how communities can support each other. Tyson told her about his work with young people, trying to help them avoid the mistakes he had made in his own youth. "You know," Margaret said, "I taught for 42 years, and I thought I understood how the world worked. I thought if you were honest and kind and followed the rules, you would be treated fairly. Today shook that belief." "Maybe," Tyson said thoughtfully. "The world isn't as fair as it should be, but today also showed you something else. It showed you that there are still people willing to stand up for what's right. Those construction workers, that teenager with the phone, the nurse. They didn't even know you, but they stood up for you anyway." Margaret smiled for the first time since the whole ordeal began. "You're right. And you stood up for me too." "Why? Did you do that? You could have just walked by." "Because that's what decent people do," Tyson replied. "And because I've been in situations where I needed someone to stand up for me, and I know how important it is." Around 6 o'clock, there was a knock at Margaret's door. Tyson looked through the window and saw a woman in her 50s holding a young boy's hand. "That must be Tommy and his grandmother," Margaret said, opening the door. "Mrs. Thompson," the woman said, "we heard about what happened to you today. Are you okay?" Word had indeed spread through the neighborhood, but not in the way Margaret had feared. Instead of gossip and judgment, people were showing up to check on her and offer support. "I'm fine, dear," Margaret said, inviting them in, "and I still have everything I need to make Tommy his soup." Little Tommy, who was about 7 years old, looked up at Tyson with wide eyes. "Are you really Mike Tyson?" "I am," Tyson said, kneeling down to the boy's level. "And I heard you've been sick. Are you feeling better?" "A little bit. Mrs. Thompson makes the best chicken soup in the world. It always makes me feel better." As Margaret started preparing the soup, more neighbors began stopping by, not to be nosy or intrusive, but to offer genuine support and to make sure she was okay. Mr. Murphy from the market brought her a fresh loaf of bread to replace the one that had been damaged. Mrs. Chen brought flowers from her garden. Other neighbors brought kind words and offers to help with anything she needed. "This is incredible," Tyson observed, watching the steady stream of people who cared about Margaret's well-being. "This is what community is supposed to look like." By 8 o'clock, Margaret's small living room was full of neighbors sharing soup and conversation. The day that had started as the worst of Margaret's recent memory was ending as one that restored her faith in human kindness. "You know what I realized today?" Margaret said to the room full of people. "Bad things can happen to good people, even when they do everything right. But good people will also show up to help when those bad things happen." The teenager who had recorded the incident had come by with his grandmother, and he showed Margaret that the video was already being shared online. But instead of being embarrassed by the attention, Margaret saw it as an opportunity. "Maybe if enough people see what happened to me, it won't happen to someone else," she said. "Maybe some other officer will remember my story and choose to handle things differently." 3 months later, Margaret received a call from Officer Rodriguez. He told her that the incident had led to new training procedures for his department. All officers now had to attend workshops on de-escalation and community relations. The video of her encounter had become a teaching tool to help other officers understand the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect. Walsh had requested a transfer to a different precinct and continued to struggle with accepting responsibility for his actions. But Rodriguez had grown from the experience and was working to become the kind of officer he should have been that day. Tyson kept his promise to stay in touch with Margaret. He visited her regularly, always bringing stories from his community work and always making sure she had everything she needed. Their unlikely friendship became one of the most meaningful relationships in both their lives. Margaret never stopped making soup for sick neighbors, never stopped believing in the power of community, and never forgot the lesson that even in our darkest moments, there are people willing to stand up for what's right. The day that started as a nightmare became the beginning of a deeper understanding of both human cruelty and human kindness. And every time she told the story, Margaret made sure to mention that while the police officers made a terrible mistake, the community response showed her that most people, when given the chance, will choose to do the right thing.